Good afternoon. Welcome back to Storytime as we continue our series with Too Much Salt and Pepper by Sam Campbell. We are in Chapter 9, Play is the Thing, the Naturalness of Joy. The next morning we were awakened early by a duet of Carol's giggles and Salt's grunts. They were both up before the sun to launch a staunch and lasting friendship. In fact, it seemed to be a case of love at first sight. Carol kept telling Salt how clever, cunning, and utterly wonderful he was, until his masculine vanity was inflated like a barrage balloon. And Salt couldn't have given a finer exhibition of showing off had he been an adolescent youth. He honked and honked in his happiest tones. He whirled about like a top, acting his toughest. He climbed a few feet up a tree, slid down, and raced to another. Climbed a little way on that, and then raced to a third and a fourth, and Carol's rippling laughter followed him everywhere. He chewed on the front door sill, scratched on the screen, then raced around and repeated the acts at the back door, all to no other purpose than to show off. When Carol was called into breakfast, she was so exhausted from laughter that she could hardly eat. "I never knew a porcupine could be so cute," she said breathlessly. Then, in an unsuccessful effort to become serious, she added, "I guess I am not listening so well this morning, but this is so much fun." "Surely it is fun, Carol. When we speak of silence, we do not speak of sadness. Nature wears a smile on her face, for there is joy in her heart. Those who do not know the joy side of nature, the actual fun that is found in her creatures, do not know nature at all." I said to her, my own sides aching from laughing at Salt and his antics, "After breakfast, I want to show you something about Salt. It has to do with our nature subject for the day." "And what is our nature subject for today?" Carol giggled some more as she looked through the window to where Salt had gone into a new spasm of toughness. "It is the subject of joy, natural joy. And while we completely annihilated the breakfast Jenny had prepared, we talked about the good cheer, happiness, and actual fun which can be found in nature's creatures. One springtime, Carol, a pair of tiny house wrens came to our sanctuary to teach us a lesson we have never forgotten. Jenny and Jimmy Wren, we named them, and they seemed right pleased when we found them the little house we had prepared for someone like them. It was a smart-looking house, made of tiny loglets and a weather-tight green shingle roof. It hung from the lowest limb of a hemlock tree not far from our cabin door, for we knew that wrens were sociable creatures. The door of the house was the size and shape of a 25-cent piece, and this was in accordance with their desires too. Obviously they liked the house. At first sight of it, they made the very air sparkle with their bubbling song. They flew down and inspected the roof, then sang about that. They looked over the doorway and sang some more. They hopped about the tree in which the house was hung and found more reason for song. Now, Carol, a wren has more song per pound than any other living creature. Tiny, little mites they are, just about 2 steps beyond being bugs. But when they sing, a ripple runs all the way from the tips of the tails to the ends of their beaks. The advice is often given to the vocal student, put your heart into your singing. A wren goes beyond that. Not only his heart is in it, but all the rest of him too, even his feathers. He gargles a grand aria. Nest building began at once, so close at hand we could see every move. While Jenny did most of the work, Jimmy carried on the song. Maybe that means he is lazy, maybe not. Perhaps that song was just as important as the twigs and grass Jenny brought in, and the work she did in weaving them together. Occasionally he would make a contribution of a twig or so, but not often. Most of the time he sat on a small limb above the swinging house and told the world how happy he was. Jenny sang some too, but she didn't have as much breath for it as he did. Then the building of the nest went along pretty well. Then, through some miscalculation, Jenny brought in a good-sized forked twig, too large to be taken easily through the tiny doorway. She tried to force it in, but it stuck. She jerked it out and tried it another way. Again it failed to go through the opening. And now we watched a bit of woodland philosophy we have never forgotten. Obviously, Jenny had taken on a task that was nearly too much for her. The twig became lodged in the opening, and she could not budge it either in or out. She fluttered and flew about her task, pushing on the twig and striving to get it through. But hard as the problem was, her happiness was never dampened in the least. Regularly, she would deliberately stop her work, hop up in a tree near the swoon-crooning Jimmy, and join in the singing. After a few verses, she would return to her task with new strength, and resume her efforts to move the twig. For a long time it defied her, but at the moment when discouragement might have made her give up, she would cease her labors and sing again. Finally, between work and song, the twig was forced through the little door, and then Jenny and Jimmy really sang. Later, when we cleaned out the house in the autumn, we tried pushing that twig through the tiny door. We found that it took a surprising amount of pressure to force it through. Jenny could never have done it without a song. Carol listened delightedly to the story. "I'll bet I know the lesson that teaches," she said. "What is it, Carol?" "When you are doing a hard job, stop and sing once in a while. That is, keep happy and cheerful." "That is it, Carol. Good cheer is a kind of strength in itself. Whatever the task before us, we will do it better through the power of a happy heart than we will with a heavy one. Nature knows this. In the characters of all her children she has placed a large measure of good cheer, natural joy, and a capacity to play. The lives of animals may be severe, yet they are not sad. But their lightheartedness is not light-mindedness. Instinctively they play in a manner that is profitable to them." Now Salt helped me illustrate this point. Carol stood at the window to watch. I went out to my porcupine pal and found him in the very mood desired. He was just an imp, ready for any kind of a tussle that might come his way. Salt had learned to play a game with me. This game, I fear, was often played with time stolen from other things. But he was so cute and clever at it, I could never resist the temptation to indulge. He was not always ready to play, but when he was, as on that morning when Carol was watching, he played with a vigor that made it a lively affair. It was sort of hide-and-seek. There could be no other question about his understanding the game. He played it with skill, with a spirit of competition, and with an appreciation of the objects and aims, and with definite satisfaction when he had won, as he always did. That morning he played in earnest, perhaps conscious of the fair onlookers who watched from the window. As usual, the game began with a wild tussle. This was just to stir up proper spirit. He rose on his hind legs and came toward me, waving his front feet, giving a funny little growl, as if he meant to eat me alive. I grabbed his paws and quickly turned him on his back, thereby avoiding a quick and rather unpleasant bite, which would have been coming to me had I acted with less speed. Animals generally play roughly. They want their games to have an edge to them. A little bit of pain and danger gives sparkle to their fun. Salt was not angry at me. He didn't want to hurt me just for the sake of hurting, but he did want me to appreciate his prowess and have respect for his rushes. On his back he grumbled and growled a lot and struggled to get free. I pinched his throat, tickled his tummy, and taunted him. Then I arose and stepped back to give him time to get up. Once more he rushed me, running awkwardly on his hind feet, waving his front paws and growling menacingly. Again I turned him on his back, though this time not so efficiently. He managed to scrape some skin off a knuckle, and in scuffling with him I got 2 of his quills fastened in my arm. Now we had worked up to the spirit of the game, and hide-and-seek was on. Salt stood still, knowing what was to happen. I darted away from him and hid behind a bush. He did not follow at once, but waited for the next move of the game. I clapped my hands. This was what he was waiting for. He came at a porcupine gallop in the direction of the sound. After running a few steps, he waited for another sound signal. I clapped my hands, and on he came. This continued until he found my place of hiding, and there we held another scrimmage like the one with which we had started the game. When it was over, I pulled new quills from my arms, looked helplessly at my wounds, and then suddenly ran away a distance of 60 feet or more, there concealing myself again. Then followed more hand-clapping, more sound trailing by Salt, and another scrimmage. This game Salt and I played in daylight and dark. The routine was always the same, but I had always had to quit. He never would. As long as I would continue to hide, he would continue to seek. Sometimes I was a bit unfair. I would not clap when I was supposed to. He depended upon this sound. Since a porcupine does not see very far, he relies on hearing and a sense of smell. I was supposed to clap, and he knew it. When I did not, he was plainly disturbed. During the prolonged and unfair silence, he might even pass my hiding place behind a tree, bush, or building. Then the clapping would come from behind him. How he would whirl around when he heard it, snorting resentfully, and race back to me. After this breach of the rules, the scrimmage which followed would be severe. Occasionally I would remain silently in my hiding place, not even giving him the delayed clapping. This was not only in violation of the game rules, but called for a retaliatory maneuver. He would listen for a while, then with sudden realization that he was not going to hear me, he would utter several of his little honks and begin searching for my trail. Generally, when this had occurred, I had circled silently and arrived at a point from which I could watch him. His triumph was most apparent when he had picked up my scent. Down the trail he would go with his funny little waddle, looking for all the world like a tank that had lost its treads. I could see him following my exact route, and when he caught up to me after this trick of mine, I was in for plenty of trouble. It was through this latter ruse that I often made my escape from the game, much to Salt's disgust. I would circle the cabin and silently enter the door. He would trail me about faithfully, and when he had run his inquisitive nose against the doorstep and realized he had been tricked, he would fly into a rage. Round and round he would whirl, acting tough. He would swing through the brush and small balsam trees as if he intended to knock them down with vicious strokes of his powerful tail. Generally, he ended up his tantrum by climbing at high speed to the top of a favorite white pine. That was what he did that day as Carol and I looked on. She was so excited about the whole experience, I thought she was going to climb up after him. "Now, Carol," said I, "tell me what you observed while you were watching Salt play. What did you make of it?" "Why, he knew the rules," she exclaimed. "He knew what he was supposed to do and what you were too. He knew how to play." "True, Carol, Salt knew how to play, but there is something else we should notice. The things he does in play are such as will develop him, prepare him for his more serious experiences in the forest. In this play he practices his listening. He is cultivating his valuable instinct for locating and identifying things by sound. The same ability will guide him through the woods. It will tell him of approaching enemies. It will aid him in finding a mate. The scrimmages increase his strength, his quickness, his ability to meet problems of combat. Nature is wise with her children. She wants them to play, but in a way that prepares them to meet life's problems. Later in the day, Carol played hide-and-seek with Salt, a bit on her own account, but the incidental tussles had to be avoided as being too rough. Yet she saw in her own experience how conscious the creature was of what he was doing, and how earnest he was in it. That day we spent much time on the trails looking for the joyous, the play side of nature. Carol learned through story and observation that where there is life, there is happiness. Perhaps nature students have made too much of the troubles and tragedies of the forest. No one could be blind to that phase of nature. There are conflicts, fights, and problems aplenty among the woodfolk, but this is not all there is to be found. If the hours were counted, it would be seen that joy claims the most of them. There is a serious purpose in nature's plans, but she has pleasant ways of accomplishing it. Carol saw the play of some creatures that day. She heard of others not so easily observed. While we sat quietly at the shore of Vanishing Lake, a great osprey or fishhawk circled high, far and wide within the range of our vision. He looked like a great glider riding the air currents, dipping, diving, banking, in all having a grand old time. Once men said this bird was always on the hunt, always seeking to kill. But now we know differently. That is not the way he hunts. It is the way he plays. Though he is a predator and lives upon smaller creatures, still his time is not always given to this. He does some things purely for pleasure, and it made his flight more beautiful to us when we knew that for now at least he was drawing joy out of a simple experience. There too we watched 2 red squirrels at play. They were racing wildly along the ground when we saw them, and first thought might be that they were fighting. Such creatures do have their troubles, but this that we were seeing was sport. It was play. Notice, Carol, that the one that seems to be chasing the other never gains on him. They stay the same distance apart while they race over logs, up trees, through foliage from one tree to another, and circle around and around a great old stump. If this were a fight, one would catch the other. It would not be just a chase. Note, too, that they change places occasionally. The pursued becomes a pursuer. Now they have ceased running and sit resting for a moment, only a few feet apart. They comb out their fur with their feet, straighten out the ruffled hairs of their tails, scratch a few itchy places, and then the chase begins once more. This is play, Carol. We saw 2 fawns at play that afternoon along an old logging road. Their spotted coats were shining, and they were the very picture of animation. While the beautiful mother nibbled casually at low-hanging leaves, the 2 youngsters raced wildly about. They took turns chasing each other. Sometimes they reared on their hind feet, striking harmlessly at each other with their sharp front hooves. Yet notice, Carol, they are never off their guard. In the midst of a playful run, they came to a sharp stop and stand in perfect silence, all attention. Their large ears pivot this way and that as they listen to the messages of the forest. The wise old mother, too, pauses in her eating to listen, look, and sniff around. They know there is danger in the forest, but they are happy and playful in the midst of it. And we have watched full-grown bucks, well along in years, play as do these fawns. When we first came to the sanctuary many years ago, there was a colony of otters living up one side of one of the little creeks. They had made for themselves a slide on a clay bank. Human children on a toboggan have had no more fun than did these creatures. An otter goes sort of sliding through the world anyway. He slides along as he travels across country, walking a little and taking advantage of every little knoll to coast. In the winter, he slides through tunnels he makes in the snow. He slides into streams where he goes to fish. And so wonderful is he at swimming that he seems to slide right through the water. Hence, young otters and old ones, too, play at sliding. We had watched them often up that little creek. They kept the clay bank moist with water from their bodies. When the fun began, they would come back off in the woods and make a run for the slide. Down it they would go, nose first into the water, where they would dash about, giving a demonstration of their swimming, which thoroughly outdoes a fish. Then up the bank they would scamper again for another try at it. The competition seemed to be which could get in the most slides. Obviously, the animals were having a wonderful time. Baby beavers at play are most amusing. On the shore of a little wilderness lake in Canada, I once came upon a mother beaver and 3 youngsters. For a while I could observe them without their detecting my presence. The mother was going about the business of woodcutting, perhaps for repairing the house or dam, or maybe just for food. The babies went about woodcutting too, but on a much reduced scale. Their cuttings were about the size of a lead pencil, but they would pick up the little slivers they had cut and carry them along proudly as if their product was a full-sized dam-making log. Occasionally they would engage in scuffles, rolling over and squealing, not unlike kittens. Carol had watched colts and calves, lambs, pigs, puppies, and kittens, and laughed at their playful pranks. But she had not known that this spirit was in the wilder creatures as well. At sunset, after we had eaten dinner, she stood looking at the quiet, colorful beauty of the sky. In a soft voice, she remarked that it was the most beautiful she had ever seen. "But the one last night was more brilliant," Jenny suggested. "Yes, I know," said Carol in sweet seriousness, "but everything looks more beautiful since I have found so much joy in the world. Sometimes," she paused for a moment as if afraid her thoughts might be too serious, "sometimes when you hear all the news reports, it seems as if the whole world is just meanness, fighting. That seems to be all they want to talk about or write about. And you get the idea that the woods are that way too, with all animals just fighting all the time. Then when you can see and learn that there is fun and happiness and joy here too, well, it just makes everything more beautiful." The evening was cool. We built a grate fire and sat before it, all 3 of us a little tired from an active day, but Carol was still ambitious. "Are we awfully tired?" she asked. "Tired, but not exhausted, Carol. Why? What is on your mind? Do you suppose there would be any chance of seeing Inky if we went to the salt lick?" We stepped out to the door and looked out. The night was marvelously still, trees were dripping with moisture, and mist drifted across the starlit lake. "It feels like a magic night. Let's go," said Jenny, who is always ready for forest adventure. While we made our way to the mainland by canoe, she explained to Carol what she meant by a magic night, how it was the time when strange and stirring things happened in the woods. Inky was not at the salt lick when we arrived. We sat in silence for almost an hour, and he did not show up. Perhaps we were wrong about this magic night. Maybe something was lacking in it. As we arose to go, Jenny, disliking to disappoint Carol about seeing Inky, gave the porcupine call. Then, from directly over our heads, high in a tree against which we had been leaning, came a lazy but friendly answer. "Honk, honk," came the call, but it sounded for all the world as if it had come from a grandfather who had been awakened from his sleep and didn't entirely relish the fact. We flashed a light up the tree, and there was Inky. He had been there all the time, but apparently did not think it necessary to come down and visit. Under our constant pleading, he came to life and sluggishly made his way down the tree. Finally he stood, still half asleep, in the midst of the circle we had formed about him. Carol could hardly contain herself. "So this is the famous Inky," she said, bending to him. "You funny-looking old fellow. I've read about you, I've seen you in pictures, I've heard about you, but I didn't think I'd ever see you." Inky looked at her indifferently. So far, he was probably reviewing some dream he was having when we awakened him, and if his expression was any guide, he would rather still be dreaming. At last he took a little interest in things and permitted Carol to pet him. She was amazed at his size and the great pack of quills he carried. "You are always having conversations with him," she said to me, laughing. "You make him talk, and I wish I could see how he does it." "Well, now maybe we can demonstrate," I said. "Just look at him. See how silent, how deep, and how wise he looks. Don't you believe he would have a lot to tell us?" Yes, she did. "Well, it seems to me I hear him start to talk now. Just watch him. Anyone could see what he would say if we heard him plainly." "What would he say?" "You fellers been busy today?" went Inky's comments. "Yes, old top, we have been busy. We have been trying to learn something about the way you forest people play and how you know joy." "Yeah, you folks could do with a little information about that." Inky scratched his side, shook out his quills, twitched his nose, and went on. "Sometimes when I hear what you folks do to have a good time, as you call it, I feel sorry for you. Why do you do the things that tear down your health and your characters and call that fun? Good balsam juice, if we animals went carousing around, eating and drinking things that did us no good, we certainly would be failures at living in the woods. You noticed everything you saw in nature was building up, didn't you? You don't find any of our folks playing around unless that play is making him strong and able to get along in the world. That's what play ought to be. You don't have to tear yourselves to pieces just to have fun, do you? We see some human folks go through this woods a-puffing and blowing and complaining, hardly able to walk. Lost all their strength trying to have a good time. There's so blamed much fun in this world, fun of the right kind. Why don't you human beings wake up? Why don't you make your play develop your strength, give you health, spruce up your minds and your characters? Sometimes, by balsam juice, I get disgusted with you. You can be so much better and so much happier than you are if you'd only use some common sense." We all stood in silence. Inky looked from one to the other, and Jenny stroked his quill-capped head. "There," he went on, turning to waddle away into the night. "There, I guess I've been too mean again. You folks are kind of sensitive about your faults. You'd rather not hear about them, rather be let alone, even if you're doing the wrong thing. I suppose I shouldn't talk such stuff to you, even when I know it's right." Inky was waddling away into the darkness. He took a bite at the Salt Lake stump, but wasn't much interested. There was a dream he hadn't quite finished. He reached the base of a hemlock tree and started his climb aloft. "But remember," he called back in his unapologetic way, "if I've said anything I'm sorry for, I'm glad of it." "How do you know he said all that?" asked Carol when we reached the cabin. "Why, you were right there, Carol," I said in surprise. "Didn't you catch his words?" She admitted she didn't. "Then, young lady, you still have a lot more to learn about listening." That's the end of Chapter 9. Hope you're having a wonderful day. Have a good afternoon, and God bless. Join us tomorrow, same time, same place, for Chapter 10, The Sweetest Story Ever Told.